All right. So today we start something new. So half this class is PHP Laravel and the other half is Node and JavaScript. So today we're going to start the Node and JavaScript stuff and compare synchronous programming in PHP with asynchronous programming in JavaScript. So before we kind of get into that, midterm is next week. So make sure you kind of read these instructions, which talk about installing Laravel beforehand, setting up the database, setting up Heroku. So you should have a live instance so that you don't have to worry about it on the day of. We did it all on the first week. On the first week of Laravel, right? Because we installed Laravel and we pushed it up to Heroku. Yeah, so you could follow that again. Yeah. Yeah, so more of a side note, I teach another class and upcoming class on SQL, and so I was trying to figure out a way to teach people SQL without having to install a database, because that's just installing SQLite and everything on different platforms. So figured I'd share it. I just created like a little Laravel app so you can like try SQL against the database that we've been using in this class. So there's like an editor and you can kind of run it and see results and stuff. So this way, it's probably mostly useful for Windows users, since I didn't really cover how to install SQLite on Windows, but something to try since you're familiar with the same database. Okay, so hopefully you install Node. There's a few ways to install Node. One of them is just going to the Node site, and then you can pick a version. The LTS, it stands for long-term support, so this is generally the most stable one. And the current is kind of like the bleeding edge, so all the newest features are in there. I installed the LTS. That's one that I just kind of generally use, but if you want to experiment with some new Node feature, then you probably want to go with current. And this is the nice thing about Node, is just kind of click install. You just go through it and it works. You don't have to like do a whole lot of command line stuff. Now there's another tool also called NVM. It stands for Node Version Manager. So imagine if you want to work with multiple versions of Node on your computer. This tool makes it really easy. So just to kind of show an example, right now, I have Node installed on my computer, so it gives me access to the Node CLI. So I have 10.15.1, so I kind of downloaded the latest. But I'm not going to cover installing NVM, but if you were to install it, you have an NVM command, and you can do things like NVM ls and show all the Node versions at least installed on my computer. So sometimes I've like hopped between different versions of Node. So this is the tool I'd probably recommend going with, especially if you're kind of like you're working with different projects and they all require different versions of Node. Like sometimes my front end projects require like version 10, and then if I'm writing a back end and I want to try like the latest JavaScript features, I want to switch. And so it makes it really easy. I can change through this NVM command, and I can say NVM use 10.6 or 11. Whatever, and I can actually easily have multiple versions of Node on my computer. So just something to be aware about. I'd say a lot of people end up using this just because it's so flexible for switching between versions. But there is a little bit of command line stuff involved, so I was just trying to avoid that. So check it out if you're interested. Okay, so what we're going to cover today is just kind of going through the Node basics. What is asynchronous versus synchronous programming? Going through a few techniques for dealing with asynchronous programming. And then we'll kind of talk a little bit just like the Node ecosystem and modules, which are kind of like the equivalent of like the packages that we had in Laravel, and then like the namespaces and all that. So kind of like the equivalent. And then to kind of do something practical, we'll build a very simple API. Okay, so the first thing I want to cover is the Node REPL. So REPL stands for read, eval, print loop, and it allows you to just kind of experiment with Node. So to get into it, once you have Node installed, you can just type in Node from the command line, and you can just type in things. So I can say 1 + 1 gives me 2. I could do a little bit of JavaScript, so I could say something like my name is equal to David, and I can just do name.split. So maybe I want to split up the first and last name by a space. Gives me an array of the first and last name. So you can kind of just experiment with JavaScript in this Node REPL. So to get out of this, you can do Control-C, press it twice, and you're out. So this is one way to do it. The next way is we can actually create a file. So you can create a file, at least through the command line, you can say touch dot, I'll call my file hello.js, and this will create a file in the current directory. So let me just open up Atom, kind of where I'm currently at. So I just have a JavaScript file, and in here maybe I just do a console log. So a console log is the equivalent of like maybe like var dump or print or echo, I guess. Oh, no, echo writes at the screen. It's kind of like a logging to the console. I guess I don't know if there's an equivalent PHP. But here I can just say 1, 2, 3. So this will kind of write. And then to run this file, I can just say node in the file name. So I can say node hello.js, and it'll kind of log this out. So there's, a couple ways. Okay, so what makes Node very interesting is that it is asynchronous. And this differs from PHP because if we're looking at a PHP file, it goes line by line, right? So if I were to have, actually, let me pull up an example. Okay, so if I were to have this PHP example right here, I'm reading a file through this file get contents function. It gives me the contents back, and I can echo out the contents and then echo finish. And it goes line by line, right? So just from top to bottom. Each line waits for it to finish before continuing on to the next line. And so the right, it just shows the order of what these things are kind of written out. Now, in Node, things are asynchronous. So things that are I/O. I/O stands for input output. So things that are considered I/O would be things like writing to a file, reading to a file, talking to a database, making HTTP requests. Those are probably like the most common ones. But those are asynchronous. So if we were to look at this little JavaScript example, it says FS is like a module to read files. So I can say, let's read the file. And then once that file has been read, I can log out the contents. But the order of this, what actually happens is console log finish gets logged first, and then the contents get logged second. So it's a little backwards. And it's because in PHP, in order to continue on to the next line, it has to finish that line before it can continue. But in JavaScript, it's going to say, okay, let's fire off this read file, but it's not going to wait around to kind of finish reading the file. It's going to continue on executing, and it'll get to the console log where it says finished, log this out, and then at some point later on when this file has finished being read, this function that was passed into read file gets executed. So it's a little different because if you were to think about your PHP code, you just read it from top to bottom, right? And it just kind of makes sense. But with JavaScript, that's not necessarily the case. And things are asynchronous in Node, which kind of yield like performance benefits. So it makes it really good for web apps that do a lot of I/O. So again, I/O is like talking to the file system, talking to a database, or making HTTP requests. So I put a link to a Stack Overflow link that had a pretty good description. So when you execute something synchronously, you wait for it to finish before moving on to another task. When you execute something asynchronously, you move on to another task before it finishes. And so if we look at our example in these slides, it moved on to this console log before this finished, and then kind of came back once it did finish, and then did this console log contents. So how many people have done like browser JavaScript? Okay, most people. So you're probably familiar with a function that's asynchronous actually already. Does anybody know the function to delay something and execute a function like a few seconds or milliseconds into the future? Yeah, set timeout, set interval, pretty similar. Okay. So we go back to this hello file. So if you're not familiar with set timeout, we can do we can kind of delay something. So we can say set timeout, and we can pass it a function and some milliseconds. So we could say like in 1,000 milliseconds, execute this function. And actually, while I'm also on the subject, there's a few ways to define functions in JavaScript. So one way is to kind of do it like this way. So I have a function called a. Another way is to do this, where I assign, and so this is called like a name function because it has a name here. This is called an anonymous function, and we're assigning it to a variable name. But in both cases, you invoke it like a and then parentheses. And then there's like a new function syntax, which I'm not going to get into like all the intricacies of it, but for the most part, you can just use it in lots of places, and it's this fat arrow syntax. So you could say let a is equal to, and then a function, and then you put the body of the function between the curlies. So it's just like a little shorter. And then there's some other things like kind of it adds, but it's kind of outside the scope of this. So I'm using kind of this fat arrow function, and I can say do a log after 1,000 milliseconds, which is 1 second, and I can say 1 second has passed. So right before this set timeout, I'm going to do a console log. So I'll say 1 log 2, and then inside the set timeout, I can say log 3. So because JavaScript is or set timeout is asynchronous, this will execute this first. It'll fire this off, but it's not going to wait around for 1,000 milliseconds. It's going to continue on, move on to this statement, and then the script has finished, but then it'll kind of wait. It'll come back to this and then re-execute that. So it'll be, we'll see the 1, 2, 3. So to kind of go through this, I can say node hello.js, and you can see the 1, 2, pause, and then 3. So set timeout is asynchronous. So is set interval. For those who aren't familiar with set interval, it's kind of like set timeout, but you can actually you keep doing it on an interval. So this set timeout function, it accepts 2 arguments. So the first is a function that will execute at some point later on, so after the second argument, which is the duration to wait. So this function right here, does anybody know what this is called? What was it? Yeah, callback. Yeah, so just for like terminology, in JavaScript you'll hear this a lot, where it's like a function. When you pass a function to another function to execute, it's called a callback function. So this is a callback function because set timeout is calling it for us. So we're passing this function into the set timeout function for it to execute. Kind of like actually in PHP when we saw like, remember when we did this, it was like route / some URL, and then they had a function like this. This was a callback function, but I think in PHP they actually call it a closure. So it's like the terminology just gets a little mixed up, but between languages. But in JavaScript, yeah, it's called a callback function. So any questions on this so far? Okay, so callback functions are kind of one way for dealing with asynchronous code. So we're dealing with set timeout, which is asynchronous, and we can pass it a callback function, and this will execute at some point in the future. So callbacks are kind of one style of one asynchronous programming technique. Now the other one is called promises, and this one gets can be a little confusing at first, but I put a link to a blog post, and we're just going to kind of go through it because I think it did a really good job explaining it. Okay, so I'm just going to kind of read through it, and then we'll kind of just walk through the basics of it. So imagine you're a kid. Your mom promises you that you'll get a new phone next week. So you don't know if you'll get that phone until next week. Your mom can either really buy you a phone, or she won't buy you a phone. So when she tells you that, she's going to say, I promise I'll buy you a phone. So at that point, you're kind of there's three states here. This promise hasn't been fulfilled yet, so it's sort of pending. You're just kind of waiting. You're waiting for your mom to buy your phone, so you're waiting around. If your mom does buy you the phone, then the promise has been fulfilled. If she doesn't buy you the phone, then she kind of rejected your promise or disregarded it. So in code land, these are kind of like three keywords. So pending, fulfilled, and rejected. So the promise kind of has three different states depending on when you're waiting to find for the answer, when you actually get the answer, and then what the answer was.
For rejected, should it be not happy?
Say that again?
For rejected, should it be your mom or not happy?
Oh, maybe. Your mom is. Yeah, probably. Maybe that would make more sense. So what does that look like in code? So it's actually pretty readable for the most part. So they created a variable called will I get new phone, and it's equal to a new instance of promise. So promise is like a class in JavaScript that we can create. And this promise class, the syntax of it kind of looks like this, where you say new promise, and then you can pass it a function. Whoops. And this function will take, so it takes a callback function as its main argument, and this function will get passed two functions, resolve and reject. And so if we look at this, we can see, so that's what they're kind of doing here using the function syntax, the function keyword syntax. But it gets past a function called resolve and a function called reject. So if the mom is happy, then you call the resolve, or I guess your mom would call the resolve with the phone. And if she wasn't happy, then she'll call that reject function with a reason why she didn't get you the phone. So this is kind of like what it looks like in code. So take a minute, I guess, just to think about that. Any questions? Yeah.
So it has to have the two parameters, resolve and reject?
Yeah. So every time you instantiate the promise class, it takes a function, and that function will have two functions that should get executed, either resolve or reject. If neither resolve or rejected were executed, then it's kind of left in the pending state.
You can store this in the variable and
What was that?
You can store it in will give you phone and just use it later to promise.
Will I get phone? Oh, yeah. So here, actually, let's continue, and then it'll probably make a little more sense. So you can imagine, so your mom is kind of, giving you the promise. And so to kind of make this example a little bit more complete, there was a function called ask mom. So you ask your mom, you execute that function. So you're asking your mom, and if anything, I probably would have changed this to be return will I get phone, which is the new promise, but this is how they did it. So, she gives you this promise, and if you get the phone, actually, let me actually change this a little bit. Okay, so let's see. Where is it? Okay, so we have this promise, right, called will I get phone. Now, how would it look like consuming this thing? So, if I had a function called ask mom, and mom gives me back a promise, which is will I get phone? It's this promise. She gives me back this promise, but then like, what do I do with it? How would I consume that in any way? So, in JavaScript, you can call these functions called .then, and you can chain these things. So you can say ask mom, then at some point, if she fulfills the promise, then this function will get executed and with my phone. If she says no, you don't get a phone, then this catch function will get executed, and then this function will get executed. So this is kind of looks like what it looks like from more of the consuming side. Yes.
Where is the fulfilled defined?
Fulfilled. Yeah. So.
Same thing as in promise?
Yeah. So when you call resolve with something, you call resolve with something. So this phone would actually be the fulfilled. So let me actually change this. This would actually be the phone. So I would say phone, and then.
Just be reason.
Yeah, so your mom is the one that gave you the promise, and she's the one in control of resolving or rejecting that promise. If she resolved the promise, she's resolving it with this phone, or she's rejecting it with some reason, like you didn't do your homework or something. But from a consumer standpoint, like from my point of view, I ask mom, and then I just kind of wait. At some point in the future, if she rejects it, that resolve function, so resolve phone will match with this phone, the thing that gets passed to it, and then this reject reason will be this reason. And so in this example, it's also asynchronous in a way because you ask your mom, and then later, she's not going to give you the phone right now. She's probably waiting for you to do something like your homework. And so it's asynchronous because it just doesn't happen at that time. Oops. Any questions? Yeah, so take a look at the blog post. They kind of go in a little bit more depth, but it's pretty useful. So what I wanted to do was kind of a little exercise just in class, and let's look at that set timeout again. Oh, I actually deleted it, but right. So set timeout was this. Okay, so this is like the set timeout function, and this is leveraging a callback function. So as an exercise, let's define a function called timeout that takes in some milliseconds. And from a consuming standpoint, I could say timeout 1000 dot then, and I can say log1. So we're going to promisify. We're going to create a function that sort of promisifies the set timeout function. So we're kind of going for something like this. So you'll fill in this in order to make this work. So I'll kind of leave this example up so you can kind of, look at the two back and forth. I'm just moving this around so it kind of fits all on one screen for the most part. Now in this timeout example, it won't have like a catch because there's really not going to be any error. But see if you can kind of, using kind of this as an example, try and get this to work. Oh, yeah. Yeah.
The ask mom variable, when you are using that, shouldn't that be like ask mom parentheses?
Ask. Yes. Yeah, sorry. That should be that. Thanks. So also maybe like a side note, this thing in theory would not get created until you ask mom. Like she wouldn't give you a promise before you ask the question. So just to make this like, more correct, it would be more like this. So I ask mom, then she'll create the promise, and then give me back that promise, or give me that promise, or return that promise. Anyone get it? Okay, so we can run it by saying node timeout.js, and we're going to get an error. And so it's going to say, like, then cannot read then of undefined, so clearly it doesn't work. So kind of like this other one, we're going to, because we're calling then off of timeout, this thing is expected to return a promise. So timeout's expected to return a promise. So we can just start off by saying new, return new promise, and it takes the resolve and reject as parameters to its callback function. That's kind of like the first piece. So now if we were to run it, we don't get any errors, but we don't see console log 1 being run. Anyone want to guess why? It hasn't been resolved, yeah, because I never executed resolve. So what we can do is we can take this piece of code, and we'll go ahead and execute set timeout. But instead of 1,000 milliseconds, we're going to take the milliseconds that we passed in to timeout. So I'll replace 1,000 with ms. And then instead of doing console log 1, I am going to just call resolve. So by resolving or fulfilling the promise, that will trigger this function to execute. So in this case, like the mom example, we resolve with the phone, but in this case, we're just resolving with nothing. Now to try this out again, so we'll go back and then run this, and now you can see like there was that 1 second delay, and then we saw console log 1 being run. Now we could even do this a little bit. Maybe we want to resolve with the number of milliseconds, so we could say resolve with ms, and then this would be, I'm just going to rename them so you can see that like they don't have to be called the same thing, but I could say weighted something milliseconds. Also, like in JavaScript, if you use like the backticks, it's kind of like PHP's version of double-quoted strings. And you could say like name, so it's kind of like the equivalent. Whoops. Another form of like string concatenation. But so if I run this, you can see weighted 1,000 milliseconds. So we're kind of resolving with a value here. So you can resolve with a value, or you can resolve just with nothing. So we just converted kind of set timeout into a timeout function that returns a promise instead. So there, with asynchronous programming, we can kind of deal with it using the callback style or the promise style, but you're going to see both as we work with Node. Now, just to kind of play around with this a little bit, we could say reject, and if we reject, then the catch function would get executed. So I could just say log rejected, and this would actually be the milliseconds too. Oh, let's see. So rejected. And sometimes I just like to space these out a little bit different, just to make it less messy. So it's kind of up to you, but I'd say this is probably a pretty common pattern for like formatting this type of code. If I were to go back and then kind of rerun this, we can see we rejected with 1,000. But in this case, like it doesn't really make sense to reject, so we're just going to resolve. But you can imagine like, set timeout is, one async operation, but you can imagine like talking to a database, right? That could potentially fail if you had like the wrong credentials, in which case then you would want to reject the promise and then have your catch block or catch function executed. Now there's also another syntax to this. You could say .then for the success and then .catch. Another approach is actually taking this error one and then doing it as the second argument to .then. So kind of like this. So success and then rejected, or fulfilled and rejected. This style is probably a little bit more common, but just kind of wanted to show you both because you can do both. Any questions? Okay, so what I thought would be kind of like, practical and like leveraging Node, we'll build a simple API that talks to that same database we've been using, that SQLite database, do some queries like a select star from artist, and send that data down as JSON. And I'll kind of get into this a little bit more. So okay, so before we had our Laravel app, and then like here's our browser. So you make a request, like a GET request, right? So we say like make a GET request to /users, and this returns back some HTML, right? So this is server rendered. The HTML is being generated on the front end, or on the back end. So this portion of the class is we're gonna create an API. So instead of like sending down HTML, we might make a GET request to something like /users, and then this node API would send back down JSON. And so JSON is kind of like one data format for sending down a bunch of data, and then the client or the browser would be responsible for taking this JSON and building up a bunch of HTML. And that's where things like React, Angular, Ember come in, and you can build like a client-side application from this JSON. But that's the client-side stuff, that's another class. So what we're going to do is just this portion right here. So creating the Node API that serves down JSON. So it's just kind of spitting out JSON data. So we're not going to do any like HTML generation from the Node side. You can do that if you want. So you could actually do this whole like server rendered process in Node. But I'd say most people end up using it this way, where you have a Node API that sends down JSON, then you have some type of like client-side framework that deals with turning the JSON into like HTML. So in order to build this API, I want to talk about REST API. So there's kind of, when most people talk about APIs, they're going to be talking about what's called a RESTful API. And a RESTful API is kind of like a set of conventions around building APIs. So you can pretty much, let's see. When it comes to databases, right, these are probably like your four main options. You're going to, let me just mode. You're going to either create data, which is like an insert statement. You're going to either read data, which is like select something from a table. You'll do an update statement for editing data, or a delete statement for deleting data. So these are like your four main operations. I'd say most things can be modeled this way. So if I want to kind of model, so the acronym for this is called CRUD, so C-U-R-D, so create, read, update, and delete. So what does CRUD look like when using HTTP? So this API right here, this is all based on HTTP. I'm making an HTTP request using get/users. This is like doing a read, and I'm sending down a list of users in JSON format. So this is, this is just the read in CRUD. So how might I model the CRUD for users over HTTP? Because in my app, I probably want to create users. I want to read users. I want to delete users. I want to edit users. So what would that look like? So one approach is we do something like this. We create some endpoints. Maybe I have an endpoint called list posts or list users, delete posts, and I give it like the ID of the one to delete, or create posts and then pass along some data in the query string, or do like a post request and then send that data along in the post request. And maybe for like updating a post, I do a post request, pass along the ID and the URL, and then that post body contains the data, kind of like with a form submission. So this is kind of, I'm just kind of making something up, something that, sort of makes sense. But REST APIs, they kind of apply some conventions for these CRUD operations on APIs. And REST APIs are really based on really simple URLs. So in this example here, like I was just making up words, but I wouldn't say this is like super conventional, and it wasn't very, very conventional, and the URLs are all unique, right? They're not, it's not really that simple. Okay, so the two URLs in a REST API are essentially broken down into this. I'm either going to get a collection of things, so like I'm getting a list of posts, or I'm deleting or creating or updating a single thing with an ID. So in a REST API, you basically have two URLs, assuming I'm dealing with like a post model. So two URLs, that's all you have to remember. And you can model all of this CRUD using just these two URLs. But how do before I had 4 URLs for the 4 different CRUD operations. So how do I just take 2 URLs and do it? So we can leverage the HTTP method or verb. And so we've seen in forms that there's get and post. Get is for typically retrieving data. Post is when you're doing like a form submission, when you're creating data. But there's actually a few others. And there's put and patch, which is typically used for updating. And then there's also one called delete for deleting. In HTML forms, only the first 2 work. But you can actually make these other types of requests through like AJAX, which is a way to make a request from a browser to an API. So this is like a full RESTful API, like what it might look like for a post model. So if I want to get a list of posts, so we're going to just kind of go top down. If I want to get a list of posts, I'm going to make a GET request to /post, and this will return me like an array of objects, kind of like with Eloquent and stuff, right? Get an array of post objects. If I want to get a single post, I would say /post/ and then the ID of the post, like the unique identifier, and this would return just a single post. Also, in this description here, there's this word resource. Resource, you can think of it as like the model you're dealing with. So in this case, the resource is post. So I have a post resource that I'm operating on. If I want to delete a post, I would make a delete request to /post/1. So I want to delete a single one. If I want to create a post, I would use that /post URL and then send along some data. So it's like I'm adding this data to this collection, and it'll get created in this collection of posts. If I want to update, so there's 2 different ones. Some people use put, some people use patch. There's like a minor difference between the 2, but the URL is the same, so it's typically /post/ and then the ID of the thing you're updating. And so you can see like all these URLs are the same, but the only thing I'm really changing is the HTTP method. So get, post, put, and delete. This is also like a really common interview question, is like design a RESTful API. So if you ever enter kind of like the web dev field, this will probably come up. So good to keep in mind. Any questions? Okay, so the reason I kind of wanted to just go over that is we're going to build like a little API in Express, just following the conventions and just knowing like where I'm coming up with this naming scheme. Okay, so in my folder, I'm just going to create a new folder called Node. And then inside this folder, I'm going to create one called app.js. So this will be like our entry point to our app. So we're going to write pretty much all our JavaScript in this one single file. And then we're going to, let me cd into that Node folder. And then I'll be able to run node app.js, and this will kind of like start running our API. So this is a little bit, different than Laravel, because Laravel scaffolded out an entire application. Here I'm just manually creating files. So Express, I would say, is not even really a framework. It's just like a routing library, whereas Laravel is a little bit more encompassing. It has a lot more to offer. So you just have to kind of like build your own little framework. Okay, so in Laravel, we had composer.json, right? Anyone remember what that was for? Yeah, all the packages. So like all the libraries that came with Laravel when you installed it in order for Laravel to work. So like the auth class and the DB class, all those things, right? To make it work, it was part of Composer, the package management. Node has the same thing, and this one, instead of composer.json, it's package.json. And this is a JSON file, so we can use these curly braces. Okay, so we can actually just list these dependencies in here under this key called dependencies. Dependencies. And so the first one that we're going to use is one called Express, and this is probably the most popular, like to create like routing library. So kind of like in Laravel, when I said route : get or route : post in order to say here's my URL, invoke this controller, like that equivalent piece is built into this thing called Express. Okay, so we can list different versions. I'm just gonna pick, I kind of did this before, so 4.16.4, which is the latest. Another package that we're gonna add is this thing called, I actually don't know how to pronounce this, but Knex, I don't know. But this is the equivalent to that DB query builder in Laravel. So in order for us to write SQL. So this will be 0.16.3, which is that latest one. And then the last one is SQLite 3, because we're going to be talking to a SQLite 3 database, and this Knex query builder needs this one to know how to talk to SQLite. So this one is 4.0.6. Okay, so in order to install this, we can run npm install from the command line. And so when you install Node, you get this npm command. And The nice thing about Node is when you install it, right, it just came with it, and you don't have to like download the composer file and put it in the path and that whole thing, right? It was just kind of installed, which makes Node really approachable. Okay, so what that did was it created this Node modules folder inside of my project, which is kind of like the vendor folder that Composer gave us. So if we were to look at, okay, so I ran npm and then install. So where did it get all these packages from? So there's a registry called npm.js, and you can look up like all these Node packages or any other Node packages. So I can look up Express, and I can see here's Express, and the latest version is 4.16.4, which is, the latest. So you can kind of look for all different kinds of packages here, but that's essentially what I listed, and then you run npm install to install everything.
Can I see a package?
Sure. Okay, so we got our dependencies. We have our app.js file. Now let's kind of start creating our Node file. So the way we can leverage these things inside of Node modules is we can call this function called require. So I'm going to say require express. And the keyword that we pass to require is the package name, which is this. So I'm requiring this, and this actually gives me back a, we could say like, it gives me back a function I just call it express. So we'll save it to a variable. Now let's kind of get this web server going. So one of the interesting things about Node is kind of like with PHP, we just take our files and dump it into a directory in some web server like GoDaddy or some server, and it gets served. Node isn't like that. You don't just take files and then dump them in a folder and they get served. You actually have to create the server via code. So, if you think about PHP, a lot of times the web server used is either like Apache. So people would take PHP files, dump into a folder where Apache serves up those files based on every web request. Here we actually have to create a server in code. So what that looks like is, and we can do this through this Express library. So I can say we're going to create our app, and this will be the result of invoking the Express function. And then I can say app listen on some port. So I'll just say 8,000. Now, oh, question? No, you could say 3,000, 4,000. Yeah. Now, in order for me to create my routes, I'm going to say app dot. I'm going to do a get request to /genres. So I'm going to say app get, so this corresponds to that HTTP method, genres, and then we'll execute some function. So this callback function. So when a request comes in for /genres, this function will get executed, and this function actually receives two parameters. One is the request, and one is the response. So these are like different objects. And what we can do is we can say response.json and then just pass it like an empty array. So I could say like 1, 2, 3. And so this code right here will say when a request comes in for /genres, let's just return some JSON to the browser, and it's going to be an array of 1, 2, 3. So we had to create our server in code, which kind of makes Node a little bit different than like PHP. Okay, so let's go ahead and run this. So if I go to my command line, I can say node app.js, and it's going to hang there. So it's not like frozen or anything. It's just hanging because it's waiting for a request to come in from when we said, hey, when we told the server, listen on this port and wait for a request. So that's why it's, it didn't terminate. So now we can go to our browser and go to localhost 8000/genres, and you can see an array probably being spit out to the screen. Now, if this is your first time like serving up JSON in a browser, you might need an extension. Otherwise, it probably doesn't look like this. So what you can do is just type in JSON view in Chrome, and then I think it's like the first Chrome extension, and just do add to Chrome, and then just refresh, and it should probably be formatted. Yeah, there's a lot of them out there. I think the one I just Googled was JSON view, which is this one. I think this is the one I have. Maybe I have a different one actually, but they're all pretty good. So. Oh, I think mine is called JSON formatter, but they're roughly equivalent. Okay, so if we're making an API, one common convention that you often see is like in the URL, the URL path is kind of prefixed with API, so it's like API genres, just to kind of separate it from maybe other URLs. So if I change this and then navigate to API/genres, okay, so it says cannot make a GET request to API genre, so it's not finding this route. So the thing with Node is we ran Node like this, but in order for the file changes to take effect, you actually have to Control-C and then restart it. You have to restart the server. So Control-C, press up to kind of restart. Now if I go back, refresh, you can see I get the same result. Okay, so that's probably a little annoying, right? Having to do that every single time. So luckily, someone has made like a package for this to deal with it. So there's another package called nodemon. So we can say npm install -g nodemon. And this is kind of like, so we're saying install this nodemon package, but we're installing it globally because it's like a global tool. It's a global command line that's used on our computer. It's not like a per project command. So that's what the -g flag is. So I'm going to install this. And then from here, I can say node, instead of saying node and then app.js, I'll say nodemon app.js. And so anytime I change files, this will just restart the server. It'll automatically do it. Yeah. So it gets rid of that like headache. So any questions on this so far? Yes.
If this is like operation rejected by operating system,
What was it?
operation was rejected by your operating system, like the install in node one.
It shouldn't, because this is just you're on a Mac, so yeah, I don't think it should, unless you have like an older version of Node or something. Maybe there's an error because of that. So like check to make sure you have like the Node version 10 you're running, which you can do by doing so like node-v. So wait, did it not work for everybody or did it work?
I got the same error.
Oh, I know why. It's because I installed it differently. Yeah, okay, it's because I was using NVM, which kind of does things a little bit differently. Yeah, so actually just prefix this with sudo. So say sudo sudo npm install -g nodemon. Then let me know if that worked. Did that work? Cool. Okay, so go back and you can say nodemon app.js. Hopefully it works. Okay, so let's use that Knex library to fetch our data from our database. So the first thing I'm going to do is I'm going to say let Knex equals require. To really ask the person, how do you pronounce this? Let me actually. Okay, so reopen it just to make the sidebar more minimal. Okay, so let's go ahead and download that database into that project. So you can find it on the class site and sample SQLite database. We'll just kind of re-download this. So download. Yeah, you can just put it in the like the root of the project. Okay, so go ahead and download it and then extract it. And yeah. If you want, you could also put it inside like a database folder too. Or maybe we'll just do everything in the root. Okay, so the way this query builder works, it's going to feel familiar to that DB class, but okay, so we have to make a connection to that our database. So we're going to say this next, and we're going to invoke it with an object, and then it's going to take a few properties. So the first one is going to be SQLite 3. And then there's another property in here called connection that contains an object. And then the file name. So this is chinook.db. Oops. So we can say let connection is equal to this thing. So from here, we can say connection.select from genres. Now, I mentioned like in Node, most things that are I/O are asynchronous. So I/O meaning talking to the file system, talking to a database, or you can make like API calls from Node as well. So we're talking to a database right now. So this is asynchronous. So this thing actually returns a promise. So from here, I could say .then, and this promise will be resolved with the results, the database results. So in this case, it's actually a list of genres. So maybe I could be more specific and I can just say genres. So at this point, I can say, looking at this code, I don't want to send the JSON response here. I would actually want to do it after I've gotten the results from the database, right? So I'm going to move it inside this function here. And then instead of sending down 1, 2, 3, I'm going to send down genres. Yes?
How do we know the genres that we passed into that function is the genres that return from?
Oh, because like behind the scenes, this function is returning a promise that resolves with the database. So like underneath the hood, they're doing select star from genres, gathering the data, but then like they're doing something like this: return new promise, where you get a resolve and reject function, and then kind of here they're gonna say, okay, kind of get results, and then they're going to resolve with those results, or I guess this would be genres, right? So they're giving us a promise, and then they're resolving it with those genres. So that's what this is.
So the results name is like by default genres.
You can call this really whatever you want, because this is just a parameter to a function. So I could just call this results if I wanted to. But the thing that, like from a consuming standpoint, this promise resolves with the genres. So I call the genres because it just seems the most intuitive, like naming wise. But you could call it something else.
It actually is.
It's like an array of genres. Yeah, kind of like you know how eloquent returned an array of objects.
Yeah.
It's the same thing.
So, and that is actually the thing that returned from
the database. Yes. Yeah. Yes.
So since this is all asynchronous, how do we know that the connection.select statement won't run before connection is instantiated?
So this part, like, it's going to execute this. This is synchronous. It's this part that is asynchronous. Like, yeah, this part is asynchronous.
So it's just like variable declaration that's synchronous?
The things that are asynchronous are talking to the file system, talking to a database, and maybe a couple other things here and there. But like in this case, we're talking to a database. So this, like, I think making the connection here, this is synchronous.
Okay.
Yeah. But then this is asynchronous. So yeah, you always, like when you look at like docs and stuff, they'll say this thing is asynchronous or this thing is synchronous. So really kind of comparing it to our PHP code, like we just added this extra then thing, but for the most part, it's still like semi-linear. Okay, so now if I refresh, you can see you get a bunch of genres. So this is kind of like your first API. Any questions? All right, let's make one more endpoint. So I'm going to copy this, and we're going to modify it so that it's, let's return a single genre. So instead of genres, we're going to follow those REST conventions, and this is going to be a placeholder. So we're going to find a genre by its ID. So in this case, like in Laravel, we did these curly braces, right? This was like the syntax for doing a placeholder. In Express, it's actually :ID. So this is like a wildcard parameter. Okay, so the first thing that we need to do is get the ID from the request. So in this case, it would be like if I do genres/3, this is metal. So it should just return the single metal object. Okay, so how do we get this ID? So we can say ID is equal, and we can gather this from the request. So I can say request.params.id. So this request object here has access to these URL parameters, or these placeholders. So in this case, it's called ID, and then that's why it's called ID right here. Now, if you want to make sure like we got the ID, I can say console log ID. So if I go here and refresh, now it's still returning the list because I haven't changed the rest of this code. But if you go to your console, you can see, oh, here's 3. So the console log will kind of like write out to here. So handy for debugging. Okay, so here, I'm going to break this out onto multiple lines because this is going to get just a little longer. Okay, so we're going to add a where clause, right? Because ideally, we want to say select star from genres where genre ID is equal to this ID, like in plain SQL. So I can say dot where genre ID is equal to ID. So you don't have to, like in Laravel, we pass a string of the equal sign. Here we don't. Now this actually gives us back a list. So these select statements return us a list. So I want to say, give me the first one. So I'm going to say dot first, because I just want one single object. Now this this function will resolve with a single genre, so not a list of genres. So I'm going to change this just to genre, just for better naming. So we do this select statement. It returns a promise. We get back the genre once that promise is fulfilled, and then we'll just send that down as JSON. Okay, so if we refresh, we can see we get back metal. And we can change this to 5 and get different genres. So we've done like the 2 read operations for an API for a genre resource. Okay, so right now, these are successful API calls. So if I were to go to network, just kind of refresh and look at it, we can see, okay, 200, okay, so 200 means good. Anything in the 200 range is generally good, but I'd say the most common like status code is 200 for success. Oh, wow, this is interesting. Whoa, this is new. Okay. Huh. Yeah, you can type in a variable JSON, and this is like this. That's cool. Okay, so what happens if I typed in like, something that does not exist? I got an error. And so we look at network. Looks like it said 200 okay, which is not really correct. The response was empty, so it didn't find anything, so it just was empty. So does anyone know like the status code when something is like a page is not found? Yeah, 404. Yeah, you see 404 not found, like in Laravel actually. Yeah, so that's pretty common convention. So how can we do this? Right now genre is empty. It's like undefined or null from the database. So we could actually say, just add a little if statement here. We can say if there's a genre, we'll do response.json genre. Otherwise, we can say response.status 404.json, and then maybe we just pass in an object saying like error, genre, or we can even do it as like genre $ID not found. So by default, if we don't call status, it's just 200, but if we call it, it becomes 404. Oops. So now if I go and refresh, we can see we get an error, and then the network panel says 404. So any questions? So this looks, kind of similar to our web.php file in Laravel. We have a bunch of routes. We're just, no returning views. We're just simply spitting out data. But we're talking to a database using the query builder, collecting it, and then we have like this extra promise stuff. This is more, we're consuming promises because that's what Knex returns. So we're not like creating promises. But I guess it's kind of important to know like kind of what's going on behind the scenes. Yeah.
Usually we will get a 200 status if it returns the JSON format, right? Can you try number 3, ID3, and see the status on that?
200?
I'm getting 304. Only on 3. I'm not sure if it's 304.
Oh, a status of 304?
Yeah. But on the other ones I'm getting 200.
We could check it out later. Okay, let me make sure. Okay, so I think we'll end it there for today. Oh, actually, one small thing. So if I were pushing this code up to GitHub, let me stop the server. Oh, wait, we do have to push it up to Heroku. Yes, but it's actually a lot easier than the PHP one. Okay, so initialize the Git repository. So you say git init. Now if I run git status, node modules is kind of included. So we need to ignore it just because it's one of those things that it's like our composer stuff where Heroku can just install it. So we don't need to include it in our repo to keep our repo small. So I'm going to create a file in here called .gitignore. And then here I'm just going to write node modules. So this way, ignore all that stuff. Now there's also this dsstore file. Like when you browse through the file system just manually, these things get created. So you can either just, I'll delete it. This is also one of those things, like sometimes people put this in here just because it's annoying. So it's like ds store. Okay, so now if I go back to command line, I say git status. Everything looks good. So do that so that you don't, like, because these things, even though we only installed Express, Knex, and SQLite 3, you'll find those directories in here, but those things depend on other libraries too, and those libraries depend on other libraries. So like all of that is in here, and that's why you'll see all this stuff. So it gets quite big. What was that? Oh yeah.
Outside of your other previous one was under class before.
I just reopened the project just inside there, just so it's all like self. I didn't want the other things distracting you guys. Okay, so in order to push this up to Heroku, if we actually go back to deploying Laravel to Heroku, did I put one for Node? No, I didn't. Okay. Well, good thing this is recorded. So just go to Heroku.com. And, okay, so I need to delete an app. We'll delete this one. Okay. So you shouldn't have to do that because you already have probably a bunch of like at least 3 more, I'm guessing. So create new app. I'll call this detang node. I'll just call it detang node. So call yours by your username. So I'll say create app. So I'm going to go to GitHub, and I'm going to push this up to a GitHub repository. Okay, so I'm going to create a repository just called node class. Okay, so let me make my first commit. So I'll say git add all git status so I can see this is what I'm about to commit. I'll say git commit -m done. Then I'm going to associate, oh shoot, I forgot the G. I'm going to associate my local repo with the remote repo. And I'll say, I'll just copy it. So we'll push it up. Okay, so refresh, we see the code. Now I'm going to go back to Heroku and I'm going to connect it to GitHub. So I'll say connect, and then it's ITP node. Okay, so here's that node class. I'm going to connect it. So now whenever I push to GitHub, it'll deploy it, but I need to click on enable automatic deploys first. Okay, so I'm gonna have to make one more commit because I don't think I could either click this button to deploy it or just make another commit. There's actually one other thing I have to do. So going back to here, we have to make one slight code change for this to work on Heroku. Okay, so we need to tell Heroku which port to listen on, and it's on Heroku it's 80, right? So like when you go to well, Heroku's port is exposed in an environment variable. So what I want to say is like in development, I'll use this 8000. Otherwise, like when it's on Heroku, use the one that Heroku provides. So it's actually located inside of .env.port. So that will be, so if this exists, use this. But if this ends up being like some false value, then it'll default to this, which won't work on Heroku, but this will work locally. So locally, this thing doesn't exist, so we see 8000. But then on Heroku, this will exist, so it'll use that. Yes? Oh, sure. Well, you can actually just grab it now from the repo, so because I already pushed it up. Okay, so that should be it. So now I'm going to do another git commit. So I'll say git add all, git status, git commit. I'll just say listen on port process.env.port when on Heroku. And I'll say git push. So push it up. And actually the configuration, I think, with Node is simpler. There's less like environment variables and stuff. So like hopefully this was a little refresher for next week for the midterm. So it's kind of the same thing. Just, okay, so we can see it's building. With Laravel, we had to have that proc file. We don't need a proc file here. Okay, so build succeeded. Let's try this out. Oh wait, yeah, there's one other thing I have to do. Instead of the proc file, which says like, hey, so locally, right, we ran node app.js, right, to run our API, but Heroku doesn't know to run this. So how do we tell it to run it? So what we can do is go back to the package.json file, and we can add a section called scripts. And then here we're going to add one called start. And so this is where we're going to say node app.js. So Heroku will know to execute this. So we can actually even execute this locally by going to our command line. And we can say npm start. And so by calling npm start, it will execute this thing here. So locally, like, this should still work, right? So it still works. So by putting this there, Heroku will also pick this up and say, okay, like, we'll run this. So let me push this one up. So git commit add npm start script. Okay, so let's go back to the Heroku dashboard, and we'll just wait for this to deploy. Okay, so looks like it finished. Let's refresh. Okay, so now cannot get slash. So that's because we haven't defined a route, but we see like the express error. So now if I go to slash API slash genres, there we go. See it. So really the only thing I think specific to Heroku was specifying the port, so using this environment variable, adding node app.js so it knows what to start. And yeah, behind the scenes, Heroku will see your package JSON and just run npm install for you. So because we didn't include node modules in our repository or anything, so it doesn't know about those, but it'll run it from this package JSON. So kind of a small API but running on a live site and on Heroku.
Is your repository link going to be on?
Oh, yeah. So you can get to all of them from here. Class demos, just click there. Any questions? Okay, so there's a lab. It's due in 2 weeks. This isn't on the midterm, but I still recommend starting it. So you're gonna create a couple endpoints. So they're both gonna be get endpoints. So this one's gonna be get API artist, return a list of artists from the artist table. Just one extra thing in here. So this one you're gonna kind of remap the JSON so that the keys aren't artist ID and name, like capital N name. It'll be kind of remapped. So there's a few ways you can do this. One way is to use this. I'll put a link to it, but you could also modify that select function if you look in the Knex docs. So just kind of peruse those and you can figure out a way for that. And then the other endpoint is get artists or API artists, and then with a query string called filter. So it'll filter all artists that have this filter query string value. And so this one you might want to, I put links to accessing query params in Express, and then the behind the scenes, this is probably going to do something like select star from artists where name like %a%. And so here's how to do the like syntax in that Knex library. And just like before, push up your code to GitHub and Heroku and send us an email. And yeah, so that's due in 2 weeks. No extensions on that because you're already getting 2 weeks. And let's see. Yeah, that's it for today. So any questions on midterm stuff? Cool. Yeah, see you guys next week.